Good evening and welcome to another virtual Virtuoso brought to you by the Cheyenne Symphony Orchestra. I'm William Introligator, music director and conductor, and joining me tonight is our wonderful assistant principal violist, Lauren Spaulding. Welcome, Lauren.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Oh, it's great to have you. You know, the viola doesn't get to be featured as often as we'd like, and I, for one, am super excited to hear the two musical selections that you're going to be performing with us. Before we get into that, let's talk a little bit about your background and tell us where you're from originally and when you started music and all those wonderful details.
Sure. So I'm from San Antonio originally. Texas has pretty good music programs, so they run through the school. And so I was introduced to music in 5th grade. And I chose the viola because I didn't want to carry the cello home on the bus. And who would want to play the violin? So just kidding.
Isn't it true that so often the choices of instruments when we're young have to do with carrying the instruments, the idea of getting them to and from school and stuff? Well,
yes.
Now, it's fascinating to me about that, but also the fact that you started directly on viola, because many violists started on violin or something else. And I love that you started on viola. That's so cool.
Yeah. Well, I actually had a difficult time in school. I didn't like to focus or listen to people sometimes. So I ended up not really doing much music or instrument stuff until I think I started taking private lessons, like really serious private lessons, my 11th grade year. And I didn't actually end up going into music. I went into neuroscience. I wanted to be a neurosurgeon. So I went and did 2
when
years.
I was young, I wanted to do that too. That was like one of my
Did you really?
I was going to be a brain surgeon. Wouldn't
that have been so fun?
I know. Well, it would have been intense, but you know, I was talked out of it because I was told that most of your patients don't survive in brain surgery. And I was like, oh.
Yeah, I didn't know
that's
that
so
either,
interesting. Of all things, I mean, that's such a specific thing and we have that in common. It's so funny. I'm sorry I interrupted you.
I loved it. No, that's okay. I thought that would have been such a cool job. So I actually did 2 years kind of looking at psychology and pre-med, and ended up going to my first music festival after my first summer of college. And it was sort of like eye-opening to me. I experienced chamber music for the first time, and I realized like, oh, wow, this is like the coolest thing that you could possibly do. So after that, I decided to transfer, and I flew up every other week to Oberlin to take lessons with Mr. Slowick.
Oh, how
and cool. Never looked back.
That's amazing. In a sense, it's a relatively late start to get the bug, even though you started in 5th grade, but to really get obsessed with it, not until like maybe your sophomore year of college around then.
Yeah.
That's kind of an unusual story. That's really interesting. Yeah. And I wonder if that's still reflected in the fact that you seem to still have many different interests, even though you're passionate about music.
Yeah,
what are some of your other hobbies or interests or side jobs and things?
Oh man, I sailed. I sailed every summer off the coast of California. I horseback rode and taught horseback. I taught Western. I feel like I went to sports camps for years. I played basketball into high school and was on the upper teams. And so I feel like I did a pretty wide range of everything. So, a lot of musicians who become very good kind of have strict parents about it. And mine don't know anything about music. They're wonderful and fabulous and very supportive. But I essentially had a life and then decided I liked music. So I had some catching up to do when I did finally decide. But I feel like I've just gotten to do a lot. I like to write. I have done lots of photography. My grandparents are both painters. So they've sort of taught some painting, not that I'm any good at it,
Oh,
but
wow, that's
yeah,
fascinating.
so it's fun.
I think it's fantastic that you had this whole earlier life and that, you know, all these other interests are still part of you and you bring that to your music making. I mean, I've always noticed, I mean, since we've been working together, you've been in the Cheyenne Symphony Orchestra, how long? I'm trying to remember, 5 years?
Yeah, I think about five years now.
You always seem to have like you bring something very fresh and personal and
Um,
something to your music making that I think maybe reflects the fact that you have all these other interests and things. So it's great.
yeah.
Um,
No.
so how long have you been in the Front Range area, and tell us about other orchestras and other organizations you work with?
Sure. Yeah. So I've been in the Front Range area probably about 7 years now. Um, I came from Ohio. I finished my degree at Oberlin and went to work with Erica and Jerry at CU Boulder. And what was really appealing about that situation was that they're both chamber musicians.
Right.
Erica was part of the Cavani, and Jerry obviously was former violist of the Taka now, Richard being the new one. And I just feel very passionate about chamber music, and it's a little bit of a different playing style than orchestra stuff.
Yeah.
And I feel like my playing style lends itself a little bit easier towards that. So having so many different projects being the orchestra is like, so I work with Fort Collins and I work with Colorado Symphony, I work with you all, and it just kind of, you create a life of all sorts of different orchestra stuff. But in addition to the orchestra symphonies, there's also Sphere Ensemble, which is a little bit of a crossover ensemble, crossover chamber music. There's Pro Musica Colorado, and there's Boulder Chamber Orchestra. So these are like the in-between of my chamber groups. And then there's the chamber stuff, like these duets with Aria, which, you know, working with such a fabulous chamber musician is always, you learn so much. You always learn so much. So.
Oh, absolutely. So are you in an established chamber group other than your duos that you do with Aria? Are you in like a string quartet that is a regular string quartet?
Well, yes and no. So not in a full-time classical string quartet.
Okay.
I am the co-artistic director of Red Rock Strings, and Red Rock Strings, it's sort of a crossover. So we play a lot at Red Rocks Amphitheater, and we do big work with like Kaleo and bigger names that play and perform there. A lot of that is we show up and we perform whatever music they want, usually with one rehearsal. So I wish I had a full-time classical chamber situation, a string quartet or something like that. Sure. But what I do is wonderful, and I get to play lots of string quartets. Just before all of this happened, we were going to give an April Fool's concert, where like one of the pieces, it's called Uno Bow, where we had to throw the bow between different people, and I don't know, it would have been really fun. There was some good stuff that we were going to do, but
yeah, that's
Corona.
amazing.
Yeah.
You had mentioned some of your professors at CU, and many of our Cheyenne Symphony patrons might not realize what an incredible faculty that they have there, you know, in all departments, and especially also throughout the music department. But you had mentioned about your teacher being part of the Taka Quartet, and many of our patrons might not realize that this world-renowned string quartet, the Taka String Quartet, is on the faculty and in residence in Boulder at CU, which is so great that you got to work with him.
Really lucky.
Yeah. Great.
I mean, there's not many quartets better than them in the world, so
I know it's
yeah, lucky.
Wonderful. Yeah, and it's lucky for us. I mean, selfishly, in the Cheyenne Symphony Orchestra, I know that they draw some of the best, you know, young string players to study with them for their graduate degrees, and then they often end up playing in our orchestra, and we've been very lucky over the years. Yeah. So now tell us a little bit about Aria. Aria is a close friend of yours, and the performances that we're going to hear today are the two of you playing duos for two violas, which is so cool. The sound of two violas playing together and alternating who's on the melody and who's on the accompaniment and things like that. And all the different voicings. So tell us a little bit about her and her background.
Sure, yeah. So Arya Cherigosha, she's currently at Juilliard working with famed string quartet musician Roger Tapping, which is fabulous and has brought a lot of cool information from him. And then before that, she worked with Kim Kashkashian, which is arguably the top 2 soloists in the world for viola.
Yeah.
So she has really good lineage and has a great understanding of chamber music. She was in a pre-professional string quartet that got bronze at Fishoff a couple of years ago, working with Paul Katz from the Cleveland Quartet. Just fabulous musician, wonderful human, easy to work with, probably one of the most flexible and communicative musicians I've worked with in a long time. And so especially on viola, having 2 violists play together is hard enough. So, finding another violist that is also really flexible and can, viola is kind of like playing tuba. You need to be a musician. You're not a violist. It is what I feel like you have to be to successfully say something on the viola, because it's very unwieldy and there's a lot of things you have to forgive yourself for, because you're not going to sound as instantly in tune as a violinist, or you don't have gravity to provide the musicality that a cello naturally does, because gravity moves upwards as you, I don't know. There's a lot of kind of thoughts and feelings I have about that. But working with Arya has been so much fun. I think it's going to be really cool to have you all see the bridge and see the work we've done. I guess a little bit about the bridge.
Yeah.
Bridge is mostly known as Britten's teacher.
Right, Frank Bridge is an English composer. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yes. So he was an English composer, and he's most well known as being Britten's teacher. But he was also a really, really talented violist. And I didn't know what I was getting into when I started this duet, but it is probably the hardest piece of chamber music I've played in a very long time.
Wow.
There's a lot of technical challenges and a lot of balance issues. And especially with 2 violists in a register that's kind of muted, there's a lot of balance issues, a lot of figuring out which note needs to come out the most in chord structures. Oftentimes we're playing 3 to 5 notes at a time between the 2 of us.
Yeah.
We're passing back melodies that have to come out in the texture, but at the same time you're playing a pad, and you can only play so softly on, so it has
a lot of tons of challenges. Do you think that he wrote it for himself to play? He must have been a pretty fine player.
Yeah. He wrote it for himself and Tertis for Wigmore Hall performance.
Sure,
yeah.
I'm familiar with some of his other pieces, especially I think he's written a few things for string orchestra, and they are very, the ones I'm thinking of, if I'm not mistaken, are a lot different in style than the piece you're about to perform with Arya. This piece, wasn't it written in like 1912 or thereabouts?
Thereabouts.
It almost feels as though it might have been written in response to, the oncoming war of, World War I, even though it was written just before. But it is a lament, and so it really has that quality about it. And I think there is something special about the viola that kind of ties into that mood, the darker coloration of the sound.
Yeah.
Well, I can't wait to hear you perform it with Arya. And is there anything else you want to share with our audience before we get into the bridge?
No, just please enjoy. It's one of my new favorite pieces that I had no idea.
That's great. All right, here's Frank Bridge's Lament for 2 violas from 1912. Enjoy. Bravo, Lauren. Beautiful. Wow, that Frank bridge. It's an intense and beautiful piece. I'm so glad you shared that with us.
Yeah.
Um, you had mentioned before that about some of the challenges, of the many challenges, technical challenges and musical challenges of that piece. Was that, I didn't know if there was anything you wanted to get into more specifically about that,
Sure.
since our audience has heard it now.
Yeah, well, a couple of the problem for viola is kind of in the center range of the voice.
Right.
And it's the range that our ears sort of naturally go to, but don't hear dramatically. So a lot of the problems in the bridge are there's a lot of passing off. The parts are very equal. Part one and part two are not harder and easier.
Right.
So a lot of the problems is that we're playing several different notes, about 5 notes at the same time, very often during this. And when you have 5 notes in one area of an instrument, it's really hard to bring out the melody loudly enough for someone to hear it. So there are a couple things that bridge does to make that easier. He changes the texture, so sometimes there's pizzicato going on while the main theme is going on. Yeah. Sometimes there is like lots of noodles underneath while the main theme's going on, and sometimes there's a huge noodles. Yeah, noodles, pasta. There's no pasta sauce there, but definitely noodles.
I think everybody who's not a musician probably figured that out right away, what a noodling is on an instrument. Okay.
Yep. There's some noodles. Pizzicato is when you stroke the string. Noodles when you run around aimlessly, especially on viola. It definitely sounds noodly. And then I guess one of the other things he does is separates the registers a lot. So the opening of the bridge, it comes in very low. And then the main melody. So there's 2 different options. I'm not playing the first one. I get the second one, so I'm lucky. I'm higher up. I don't have to work as hard. But having the registers so separate like that brings our ears to different, not only to hear the sound more easily, but also I think it instantly changes the character because the C string of the viola is so resonant that the type of colors you can get on the C string from something like a violin could do, they're very different. And that's what I think is really magical about this particular piece is even the end of it, the register change goes all the way from the bottom of the C string all the way up. And you can kind of play with the colors that go in between there because there's so many options. And
right.
Yeah, that's really fun on this one.
Yeah, for our audiences who aren't familiar, the C string on the viola is the lowest string, and it's got even the most, dark, rich register. The whole instrument is rich in its coloration. The C string is a string that the violin does not have. And in fact, we were talking a little bit about how the piece starts in C minor, and maybe he really wanted to make it so that the duo couldn't be played by 2 violins because of the way he chose the registration and the key. So he really wanted it to be for viola. Now, some of our audiences might be concerned that you and Aria are in close proximity performing this together, and maybe you could explain a little bit about some of the safety precautions that you've taken so that you can perform together.
Yeah, well, these are certainly interesting times, and I know we've all had to adjust and find ways to be safe and healthy and to protect other people outside of ourselves as well. So for one, it's really awesome that the Cheyenne Symphony is doing things like this to bring music to our audiences when maybe they're at home and can't. So I think that's wonderful, on all of y'all's part. But Aria and I, she flew in and was in quarantine for about a week and a half before we started rehearsing. And so we've essentially been treating it like summer camp, where we're just kind of like holed up in the same location, and we wake up, we have coffee, we practice, then we have lunch, then we practice, then we play movies and play games with the family and stuff like that. So it's been fun. It's definitely a different routine from what I'm used to currently. I mean,
Sure.
just this month recently, things have started to finally pick back up, but all virtually. So I think organizations like Cheyenne Symphony are starting to adapt to the times and try and continue to bring relevance of classical music to our audiences. So I'm giving a master class today at a festival. I have another live stream performance with Aria this afternoon for the Fort Collins Symphony. And things like this are continuing.
Yeah, that's great. The masterclass, is that via Zoom?
It's via Zoom, yeah, for 40 kids on a Bach invention.
Oh, that's great.
Yep.
You were telling me beforehand that these kids aren't just any kids, they're studying with a very famous violinist, right? Tell us.
Oh, yes. One of their teachers is a student of VII. So, she's over at Yale, and her name's Hannah Tarley. She's a fabulous violinist and soloist. And so this is Notes by the Bay in San Francisco, and
great.
It's a cool festival. So they're aligning poetry with some of these Bach inventions and discussing the chamber music problems of them. It's a very cool program.
That's so great.
Yeah.
I'm fascinated by that idea because the Bach inventions, of course, weren't originally written for strings. So.
Yes, they weren't. They were written for piano.
Yeah. So I'm so glad to hear that you're keeping busy and that you're finding more ways to perform and connect and to utilize your talents and share them. That's wonderful. Well, let's tell us a little bit about the piece by Scott Slappin that we're about to hear, because it sounds like in some ways maybe it's an homage to the Frank Bridge Lament. Maybe it's a sort of second chapter, or it's a much more recent piece, right? Tell us a little background on it.
Yeah. So from what I understand, Scott Slappin is a violist in New York, and he has the Slappin-Solomon duet, which is one of the only duets for viola that I've heard consistently of throughout my life. I first heard the piece, maybe like 12, 13 years ago, and I just found it randomly online, and it's really beautiful. The melodies are so soaring, and it's really digestible music. And I think at that point, I'd never really heard something for viola that I liked. I'm more into violin music and cello music. I think viola music has some great stuff, but melodically, a lot of the viola stuff is not as melodic as like Tchaikovsky violin concerto. And so, yeah, exactly. It's much more 20th century, which is awesome.
Yeah.
But not what I want to listen to over coffee most days. So I heard this, and I was totally blown away by not only the melody, but by kind of the interlocking lines of the two instruments. And I literally would sit at home for hours, and this was when I first had my very first computer, and I recorded one of the lines, and I would record and play along with myself.
Oh my gosh, cool.
Yeah, so this piece is it's really special to me personally, for developing my appreciation for the viola and appreciation for chamber music. So it's nice to do it with someone who's a really fabulous musician and who sort of brings to life all of the ideas I had that I can't perform by myself. So.
That is so cool. Wow, I'm so glad you're sharing something that means so much personally to you. I love that. That's fantastic. Yes. So this is the Nocturne, and we're not sure when it was written. We tried to do a little research online, but I would guess that it was sometime in the last 25 years or so.
Yeah.
And Scott Slappin is still alive and still performing, as you said, in that Slappin-Solomon duo of two violas. And you were telling me before we were recording that there are even some melodic connections between the Slappin and then the bridge piece that you played earlier. Would you mind demonstrating that?
Completely. So from the bridge, one of the main melodies is there, and then the slapping opens with that exact same chord. You know, so they're
gorgeous.
so much similar.
They're so similar. I mean, Slappin as a violist would certainly know the Frank Bridge piece and probably has performed it many times and probably taught it to students and things like that. I know, it's the exact same scoring and everything. So I kind of feel like it must be an homage or a second chapter, or like, here's a more modern installment of the Lament. This time it's Nocturne. Yeah. Yep. It's almost like a second movement of the same piece or something.
They go so well together. You know,
written almost 100 years apart, probably.
Yeah, exactly. The one thing I wish that was different, or that you could add to the program, was that the Lament actually had a caprice of some sort with it, but they lost the original
manuscript.
They lost a part. So it was actually a 2-movement piece, the bridge was. Yeah. And so had you had the caprice, the Lament, and then the Nocturne, I think that the contrast of characters would have completely been there for this program. And so, you know, having 2 viola pieces that are very dark and rich and more thoughtful, you know, I just, that's the next thing I need to find, is a really, really, really cool capricious piece for violas.
Yes. And if by some chance Scott Slappin is listening to this, we want you to write a caprice to go in between these other 2 pieces, one by you and one by bridge. Well, let's get right into it then. Again, this is Aria, and remind me of her last name again.
Charagosha.
Aria Charagosha, Lauren Spaulding, in Scott Slappin's Nocturne. Enjoy.
Perfect.
Brava again, Lauren. Fantastic. So you're such an incredibly expressive musician, and many times within the orchestra context at the Cheyenne Symphony Orchestra, maybe some of our patrons haven't noticed or appreciated that. It's wonderful that you're in the front circle as, you know, one of the leaders of the viola section. And I'm sure that after watching tonight, many of our audiences are going to be focused in on you. You're just so expressive and so musical. So brava.
Thank you.
You know, it's hard, isn't it, to get two violas to play perfectly together. Tell us a little bit about some of those challenges.
Mostly it's just intonation.
Yeah.
Viola is not known for being particularly in tune.
Why is that? I mean, why is it harder than some of the other string instruments?
You know, we think a lot about it, right? I think something about having the instrument be larger means that, for me, my interpretation is that the majority of intonation problems for viola come from the bow hand.
Not the fingering of the left hand.
Not here. So, you know, if I were to, you know, I'm not sure who's listening to this, but if I were to play lightly and press, the pitch of the sound goes sharp. So the harder in the string you are, the sharper you get. To get a good tone on the viola, you have to press really hard, or you have to find a really balanced weight that involves pressure. I won't say press. And so as you're moving between the bow, especially towards the end and the bass, or as you move down, pitch changes a lot in the instrument. So you have to find lots of balance in the right hand to make this work. And I feel like that is one of the main reasons why violas are really out of tune. So when you're playing a million chords or virtuosic passages,
like we just heard, yeah.
Not only is the spacing really large, but the balance and the weight changes every single place you are in the bow. So intonation is, I don't know why it's harder on the viola than I feel like it is on the cello. Maybe because you have 9.8 meters per second squared pushing down with you. Whereas here, you're kind of fighting it at the same time.
Right, gravity.
I'm not actually sure, but it is very challenging to play in tune.
I feel like we were really lucky tonight to hear two really like masterful violists working together in such perfect tune and such beautiful blend. And I hope that our audiences really appreciate how special it is and how much you and Aria really worked hard to bring that to us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, unfortunately, because of the, you know, pitch problems and other things about viola, they get to be the brunt of a lot of jokes. There are countless viola jokes out there. How do you feel about viola jokes? Do they bother you?
Oh, I love viola jokes. I'm like #1 fan of making fun of myself. If you're not having, if you're not going to put yourself down playing viola, like,
well, do you have a favorite viola joke that you'd like to share with our audience?
Yeah, let's see. What is the similarity between a viola and a lawsuit?
I have no idea. What is?
Everyone's happier when the case is closed.
Oh, that's terrible. Oh.
Yes, viola jokes are a thing. They're great. I love them. You know, I think the viola is an acoustically unsound instrument, and you have to find ways around it or switch to violin.
Well, I think it's great that you have a very good sense of humor, and you can, you know, not take yourself, you know, take your work seriously, but not take yourself too seriously.
Yes.
That you can't say a joke like that. I think that's awesome.
Yep.
Wow. This has been so much fun, Lauren. It's a real treat. We're so pleased to have you in the Cheyenne Symphony Orchestra. I feel that we're so lucky to have a musician and artist like yourself, and how lucky we were to have Aria as a guest friend join us for this tonight. And are there any other parting words you want to share with our audience?
No, I think just thank you both. I mean, thanks to the Cheyenne Symphony, thanks to the audience, thanks to you all for having Aria and I join you today. It was a real pleasure to learn these pieces and to have you all support the symphony and support us individually as musicians in a time that's really difficult to bring our passion to you. So
Yeah.
just appreciate being here. Thank you, William.
Well, thank you. And that passion really came through. We really feel like we should be thanking you.
No.
And from all of us at the Cheyenne Symphony Orchestra, we can't wait to get Lauren on stage and all of our musicians to perform for you live again. And we're hoping that we can do that as soon as it's safe. We hope that you and your families stay healthy and safe during this time. And we look forward to seeing you on another virtual Virtuoso, Tuesdays at 7 o'clock Mountain Time. And until then, thank you again, Lauren, and good night.